A Swedish entrepreneur, describing his first company going under in his 30s, tells the story the way most people describe a mildly disappointing vacation. It didn't work out. He learned some things. He started something else about a year later, this time with investors who had backed his first, failed company specifically because they had watched how he handled the collapse. In the American default, a first business failure is often treated as a mark against a founder, a red flag to be explained away in future pitches. Here, among a specific and telling group of investors, it was treated as evidence, proof, that this was someone worth trusting with money a second time, because he had already shown what he does when something falls apart. This video is about that inversion, and what produces it. Studies tracking entrepreneurial behavior after business failure consistently find higher rates of second attempts and higher eventual success rates on those second attempts across Nordic countries compared to cultures where a first failure more often ends someone's entrepreneurial career entirely. Researchers studying this gap point less toward differences in financial safety nets, though those matter too, and more toward something harder to measure directly: how much psychological damage a first failure does to a person's willingness to try again. To be clear, failure still hurts here. Losing a business, failing an exam, watching a plan collapse is not pain-free anywhere, and nobody in this video is claiming otherwise. What differs is not the sting of the moment, it is what that moment is allowed to mean about the person afterward. Start with the education system, because the pattern gets set early. Retaking a year of school, or retaking a specific exam, carries little of the stigma it sometimes carries elsewhere, where held-back students can face lasting social labeling among peers and even family. A Danish father, describing his daughter repeating a school year after struggling with a difficult family transition, says the decision was discussed with her teachers as simply the right pacing for her, not as a mark of failure to be managed or hidden from her friends. She stayed in touch with her original class. Nobody treated the repeated year as a secret, and by her own account, the extra time turned out to be exactly what she needed, rather than something she spent years quietly ashamed of. Compare this to education systems, where being held back functions almost as a social event, discussed and remembered by classmates for years afterward. The practical outcome, an extra year of school, is identical. What differs entirely is the meaning attached to it. Youth sports culture reflects a similar pattern, particularly in how losing gets handled at younger ages. Many Nordic youth sports leagues deliberately delay competitive scoring and rankings until children are considerably older than in cultures where competitive standings begin almost as soon as a child can hold a ball. A Swedish youth football coach describes his league's policy of not keeping official standings for players under 12, focusing instead on skill development and enjoyment of the game itself, a policy some parents new to the club initially find strange before coming to appreciate what it removes. Losing, in this context, simply means the other team scored more goals that day, not a marker in a season-long ranking a child carries with them week to week. Sports psychologists who study youth athletics find that early exposure to high-stakes competitive failure, before a child has developed the emotional tools to metabolize it well, can produce lasting risk aversion that follows a person well into adulthood, showing up later as a reluctance to attempt anything without a strong guarantee of success. Removing that early high-stakes exposure does not eliminate competitiveness. It simply delays it until a child is developmentally better equipped to handle losing without absorbing it as a statement about their own worth. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. What that early lesson about failure eventually produces in adulthood is worth sitting with carefully. Business culture carries this pattern forward directly, and the data on this is not just anecdotal. Rates of entrepreneurs starting a second company after a first one fails are considerably higher across Nordic countries than in cultures where a single business failure can follow a founder's reputation for years. Bankruptcy law itself tends to be structured with a faster, less punitive path back to solvency, treating business failure as a foreseeable, ordinary risk of attempting something ambitious, rather than as evidence of personal irresponsibility, requiring years of financial penance to atone for. A Finnish investor, Asked what he looks for in a founder pitching a second venture after a first one failed, says the failure itself is barely a consideration. What matters is the specific story of what happened and what the founder did in response. Information he considers considerably more useful than a founder whose first attempt happened to succeed, since a clean success record tells him almost nothing about how someone handles things going wrong. Public failure, the kind that plays out visibly rather than privately, tends to generate less of the pile-on quality that can define public discourse elsewhere, where a public misstep sometimes becomes an extended, almost sport-like spectacle of collective judgment. A Norwegian politician who made a well-publicized policy misjudgment early in her career describes the media coverage as critical but bounded, focused on the specific decision and its consequences rather than escalating into a broader referendum on her character or competence overall. She remained in public life, was trusted again with significant responsibility within a few years, and describes the episode now as a formative, if uncomfortable, part of her development, rather than a permanent mark against her. Cultures with a stronger appetite for public shaming as entertainment tend to extract a much higher, longer-lasting cost from public failure, one that can permanently end careers over mistakes that, examined plainly, were often actually correctable. The severity of a society's response to failure, it turns out, shapes not just how individuals feel about their own mistakes, but how willing an entire population remains to take visible risks in public life at all. There is something worth mentioning here, adjacent to this topic even if not identical to it. The Scandinavian Reset opens with a life audit chapter built around honest, non-judgmental self-assessment, the same underlying posture toward yourself that makes failure easier to metabolize without spiraling into shame. If that's useful to you, it's directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop, or get it at the pinned comment in the comment section. Back to the story. Parenting itself plays a considerable role in how this gets transmitted, often through very small, easy-to-miss moments, rather than any explicit lesson about resilience. A Norwegian mother, describing how she responds when her son fails at something he attempted, says her first question is rarely about the outcome itself. It is about what he wanted to happen, and how he feels about it not happening that way. The outcome gets discussed too, eventually. But the child's own relationship with the disappointment gets attention first, before any lesson or correction. Contrast this with a more outcome-focused parenting style, where a child's failure often triggers an immediate conversation about what went wrong and how to fix it, before the child has had space to simply feel disappointed. Both approaches care about the child improving. What differs is whether the child's emotional experience of failing gets acknowledged as legitimate on its own terms, or gets rushed past on the way to the more practical conversation about correction. The internal narrative people carry after a personal setback, the specific story a person tells themselves about what a failure means, tends to run differently here too, shaped by all of the external patterns already described, but visible most clearly in how people actually talk about their own past failures in casual conversation. A Danish man, describing a relationship that ended badly in his 30s, refers to the years that followed not as a period of brokenness he had to recover from, but simply as a difficult stretch that eventually passed, the same tone he might use to describe a hard winter. This is not emotional suppression. He describes the period as honestly painful at the time. What differs is the absence of a lasting identity built around the setback. No ongoing narrative of himself as someone damaged by what happened, just a specific hard period that ended and was followed by an ordinary life continuing afterward. Psychologists who study resilience note that how a person narrates a past failure to themselves, as a defining wound versus as a difficult chapter that closed, is one of the stronger predictors of long-term well-being following adversity, arguably more predictive than the severity of the original setback itself. Workplace culture extends this pattern into adulthood in ways that shape how people take professional risks throughout their careers. Post-mortems after a failed project, common practice in many Nordic workplaces, tend to focus explicitly on systems and decisions rather than individual blame, a structural choice that changes how honestly people are willing to discuss what actually went wrong. A Swedish product manager, describing a failed product launch at her company, recalls the retrospective meeting as focused almost entirely on what the team could learn, with no individual singled out for the outcome despite clear points where different decisions might have changed things. She contrasts this with an internship experience abroad, where a much smaller mistake produced a meeting she remembers as considerably more tense, focused more on identifying who was responsible than on understanding what to do differently. Workplaces that separate failure analysis from personal blame tend to get more honest information out of their teams, because employees are not simultaneously managing the technical problem and their own reputational risk in the same conversation. Creative and academic failure, rejected manuscripts, failed research hypotheses, projects that simply did not work, tend to be discussed with an openness that can surprise people used to treating this kind of failure as something to quietly bury rather than reference. A Finnish researcher describes presenting a failed experiment at a departmental seminar, walking colleagues through what did not work and why, a presentation format that exists specifically because negative results are considered actually useful information within her field, not a wasted effort to be hidden from a publication record. She notes that early in her career, before understanding this norm, she felt embarrassed proposing to present a failed result, only to find her colleagues considerably more interested in it than in a straightforward success, since a clear account of what does not work saves other researchers from repeating the same dead end. This normalized openness about failure within professional and academic communities changes what people are willing to attempt in the first place, since the downside of an ambitious idea not working out is considerably smaller when the failure itself can be discussed plainly rather than concealed. Take a step back for a moment, because the pattern underneath all of this is the same one that keeps surfacing throughout this entire cluster of ideas. Failure here is treated less as a verdict on a person's worth or competence, and more as data, information generated by attempting something that did not go as planned, useful precisely because it reveals something a success would not have. None of this makes failure comfortable. It simply removes the additional layer of shame that, in cultures where failure functions as identity evidence, often does more lasting damage than the practical consequences of the failure itself. A business that closes, a year repeated, a launch that flops, these things cost time and money and disappointment everywhere. What differs is whether they also cost a person their sense of who they are, or whether they were always understood, from the very beginning, as simply the price of attempting something in the first place. That distinction, between failure as information and failure as identity, is not locked behind any particular country's culture or education system. It is available to build deliberately, in how a setback gets discussed at a family dinner table, in how a workplace runs its postmortems, in the specific words a person reaches for when narrating their own past disappointments back to themselves. None of it makes the disappointment disappear. It simply determines whether that disappointment gets to end the story, or whether it becomes, eventually, just one difficult chapter inside a much longer one. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.